Welcome to Healthy Kidneys After 60. I am your host, Jane Pauley. We often talk about the golden years as a time of peace, but for many of us, the nights are far from peaceful. You might be lying in bed when a strange burning sensation begins in your toes, or perhaps a numbness that makes you feel like you are walking on. Cotton wool. We are told it is just a part of getting older, a price we pay for the years lived. But is it really? Today, we are joined by a man who has dedicated nearly 50 years to understanding the intricate pathways of the human body and the silent cries of our nervous system. He has seen over 20,000 patients and has a way of making the most complex medical mysteries feel like a conversation over coffee. Please welcome the renowned neurosurgeon and medical journalist, Dr. Sanjay Gupta. Doctor, thank you for being here with us today to shed light on something that keeps so many of our listeners awake at night.
It is a true privilege to be here, Jane. You know, in all my years of clinical practice, I have sat across from thousands of men and women who look at me with such a heavy sense of resignation in their eyes. They come in cradling their hands or limping slightly, and they tell me, "Doctor, I suppose this is just what happens when the clock keeps ticking." It breaks my heart every single time because while aging is inevitable, the specific kind of suffering we are discussing today, that agonizing burning, that terrifying loss of sensation, is often not an inevitable consequence of time. It is a signal, a very specific distress call from your nerves that something is being taken away from them. I am so grateful for this space you have created here on Healthy Kidneys After 60 because we need to peel back the curtain on why this is happening. We need to talk about why the very things we do to stay healthy might be the silent culprits behind this pain. I am ready to dive deep into these stories with you, Jane, because no one should have to accept a life of numbness as their only option.
Doctor, let's start right in the heart of the night, in those quiet, lonely hours around 3:00 a.m. when the world is asleep, but your body suddenly feels like it's under attack. I hear from so many people in their 60s and 70s who describe this exact moment. They aren't doing anything strenuous, they are just lying there, and suddenly their feet start to glow with a heat that isn't external or a sharp electric jolt shoots through their legs. It's a very isolating kind of pain because you can't see a wound, you can't see a bruise, yet the discomfort is overwhelming. There is this pervasive myth among our generation that we just have to toughen up and accept that our bodies are breaking down. We think, well, my joints ache and now my nerves burn. That must be the itinerary of old age. But you've spent decades looking at the brain and the spinal cord, and you say this isn't just a natural decline. Why is it that so many of us are experiencing this specific haunting sensation now? And why do you insist that it isn't just the calendar catching up with us?
Jane, you've touched on the exact nerve of the issue, both literally and figuratively. That 3:00 a.m. burning is perhaps one of the most misunderstood symptoms in modern geriatric medicine. When we look at the statistics in the United States alone, we are talking about over 20 million people living with what we call peripheral neuropathy. That is a staggering number. And the tragedy is that the majority of these individuals have been conditioned to believe that their nerves are simply expiring like an old battery. But let me explain what is actually happening beneath the skin. Imagine your nerves are like high-tech fiber optic cables carrying vital messages from your brain to your toes. To keep those messages moving fast and accurately, the cables are wrapped in a beautiful, fatty, protective coating called the myelin sheath. Think of it like the insulation on an electric wire. When that insulation stays thick and healthy, you feel nothing but your own movement. But when that insulation begins to fray or thin out, the electricity starts to leak. That leak is what you feel as burning, tingling, or that strange crawling sensation. It is not that your body is old, it is that the protective barrier of your nervous system is being stripped away. In my 5 decades of practice, I have seen that this erosion is rarely random. It is an active process. We have been taught to blame the years, but when I look at the clinical data and the thousands of patients I've treated, I see a different story. We see the nerves being starved of the very nutrients they need to repair that myelin insulation. Your nerves are actually incredibly resilient. They want to heal, they want to stop the burning, but they are often caught in a tug of war with factors we rarely consider during a routine checkup. The most frightening part of this, Jane, and the reason I wanted to speak on this platform is that the very medications many people over 60 take every single morning, the pills for blood sugar or the capsules for acid reflux, might be the very things thinning that insulation. We are effectively and unintentionally stripping the protective coating off our own wiring while thinking we are following doctor's orders, when You feel that heat at 3 a.m. It's not a birthday milestone. It's a biological alarm bell screaming that the repair crew for your nerves has been locked out of the building. We have to stop viewing this as a rite of passage and start viewing it as a reversible deficiency that has been overlooked by a healthcare system that is often too busy to look at the root cause.
That is a powerful and frankly quite a startling image. Doctor, the idea that our repair crew is locked out while we are just trying to follow our prescriptions, it shifts the entire perspective from a broken body to a starved system. If it isn't just the passage of time, then there must be a specific mechanism at play that targets people as they cross that 60-year mark. Many of our listeners are very diligent. They take their vitamins, they watch their sugar, and yet they still feel this decline. Is there something about the way a body age 60 and older processes these repairs that makes us more vulnerable than someone in their 30s or 40s? It feels like we are walking on a thinning tightrope, where one small deficiency can send the whole system into a tailspin.
You are absolutely right. The tightrope gets much thinner as we age. In a younger body, the metabolism is robust enough to overcome a lot of nutritional noise or interference. But once we cross 60, the way our stomach absorbs nutrients changes significantly. The production of stomach acid decreases, and a very specific protein called intrinsic factor, which is essential for grabbing B12 from our food, starts to decline. This creates a perfect storm. Even if you are eating what you think is a perfect diet, your gut might only be absorbing a fraction of the nerve repair nutrients it once did. And then we add common medications into the mix. This is the high tide of the problem. When I sit with a patient and we map out their symptoms against their medication history, a pattern almost always emerges. We see a direct correlation between the duration of certain treatments and the onset of that fire in the feet. It is a cumulative effect. The body tries to compensate for months, maybe years, but eventually the reservoir of B12 and other protective elements runs dry. That is when the symptoms shift from occasional to every single night. It's a systemic failure of maintenance, not a structural failure of the nerves themselves. We aren't just getting older, we are being depleted, and the distinction between those two things is where the hope for recovery actually lies.
Doctor, one of the most heartbreaking things I hear from our listeners is this sense of quiet surrender. They visit their primary care physicians, describing this unbearable tingling or the feeling of walking on glass, only to be met with a sympathetic shrug and a comment like, "Well, what do you expect at 70? It creates this psychological weight, a belief that they are complaining about the inevitable, which leads many to stop seeking answers altogether and just suffer in silence behind closed doors. I imagine you've seen this emotional toll firsthand in your clinic, where patients aren't just fighting physical pain, but also the fear that they are becoming a burden or that their doctors have simply given up on them. Can you tell us about someone who lived through this, someone who had almost accepted a life of agony because they were told it was just the natural tax of aging, and how that mindset shifted once they realized there was actually a biological culprit at work?
Jane, you have touched on a tragedy that plays out in thousands of exam rooms every single day. I remember vividly a gentleman named Robert Miller, a 68-year-old retired teacher living in a quiet suburb of Ohio. Robert had been living with type 2 diabetes for over 12 years, and he was a model patient, or so he thought. He took his metformin religiously every morning and night, watched his diet, and checked his blood sugar. But about 5 years ago, he started feeling this intense burning in the soles of his feet. At first, he thought it was just the wrong shoes, but soon it felt like he was standing on a hot stovetop every time he tried to walk to the mailbox. When he finally mustered the courage to tell his doctor, the response was devastatingly dismissive. His doctor looked at his age, looked at his diabetes diagnosis, and simply said, "Robert, your blood sugar is controlled, so this is just the neuropathy of aging. We just have to manage your expectations." That phrase, "manage your expectations," hit Robert like a physical blow. He went home and stopped telling his wife about the pain. He stopped going for their evening walks. He sat in his recliner watching his world shrink, believing his body was a lost cause. He told me later that the hardest part wasn't the burning itself, but the feeling that he was being erased by his own age. He felt like a ghost in his own house, because if the experts said there was no hope, who was he to argue?
It is so incredibly isolating to be told that your suffering is just a routine part of a calendar moving forward, especially when you are doing everything right, like Robert was It makes me wonder how many people are sitting in their living rooms right now, nodding along because they feel exactly like he did, ignored and hopeless. When Robert finally came to see you, what was that conversation like when you had to break the news that his model patient behavior might actually be the source of his misery? How do you even begin to tell someone that the medicine they trust is the thing stealing their mobility?
It was a very emotional afternoon in my office. Robert sat there clutching his medical records, and I looked him in the eye and asked him to tell me about his morning routine. When he mentioned the metformin, I stopped him. I explained that while metformin is a literal lifesaver for blood sugar, it has a dark secret that isn't discussed enough. It actively blocks the absorption of vitamin B12 in the gut. For 12 years, Robert had been taking a pill that was effectively starving his nerves of the one thing they needed to stay alive. When I told him his pain wasn't just aging, but was likely a severe B12 deficiency caused by his medication, he broke down and wept. It wasn't just sadness, it was an overwhelming sense of relief. He realized he wasn't crazy, he wasn't just old, and he wasn't a failure. He had been a victim of a silent side effect. We looked at his labs, and his B12 levels were at a level I would expect to see in a malnourished patient, not a middle-class man in Ohio. The realization that there was a tangible, fixable reason for his agony changed everything for him. He went from a man waiting to die in a chair to a man ready to fight for his nerves. We started him on a high-dose replenishment protocol, and the shift in his spirit was even faster than the shift in his physical pain.
He stopped seeing his feet as broken teeth and started seeing them as healing. That is the power of the right information. It restores the dignity that's...
A dismissive diagnosis steals away.
That story of Robert is a wake-up call for all of us, Doctor. It brings up a very confusing paradox that I think many of our listeners are struggling with. We are told to eat our greens, to cut out the red meat for our heart health, and to follow these healthy diets as we get older. Yet, you are saying that even those of us who are being incredibly disciplined with our nutrition might be inadvertently starving our nervous system. It feels like a betrayal. You think you are doing the right thing for your kidneys or your heart, but your nerves are paying the price in the shadows. Why is it that a diet we consider clean or healthy in our 60s and 70s can actually be a hidden trap for vitamin B12 deficiency? And how does the aging body's changing chemistry make this problem so much more dangerous than it would be for a younger person?
This is one of the most counterintuitive aspects of geriatric nutrition, Jane. We have been conditioned to believe that healthy means more plants and less animal products, which is generally true for the heart, but the nervous system has a very different set of requirements. Vitamin B12 is unique because it is primarily found in animal proteins, meat, fish, eggs, and dairy. When well-meaning people over 60 start cutting these out to lower their cholesterol, they are often unknowingly cutting off the only source of B12 their body can recognize. But the real problem isn't just what you put in your mouth, it's what your stomach does with it. As we age, our stomach lining often thins out, a condition called atrophic gastritis. This leads to a drop in stomach acid. Now, you need that acid to unlock B12 from the protein you eat. Without it, the B12 just passes right through you, unused. So you could be eating an expensive steak every night, but if your stomach acid is low, your nerves are still starving. It's like having a tank full of gas, but a clogged fuel line. The engine is still going to sputter and die.
It sounds like a desperate situation where the body's internal machinery is slowly failing to cooperate with our best intentions. If the stomach acid is declining and we are being told to eat less of the foods that contain these vital nutrients, it seems almost inevitable that we will hit a wall. You mentioned earlier that 10% to 30% of people on metformin are deficient, but what about those who aren't on medication? Is this decline in absorption just a universal tax on everyone as they get older? Or are there specific signs that our healthy lifestyle is actually backfiring on our neurological health?
It is a universal risk, Jane, but the speed of the decline varies. Research shows that about 20% of adults over the age of 60 are walking around with borderline or clinical B12 deficiency, and many don't even know it yet. The danger of a healthy diet in this context is that it masks the symptoms. People feel a bit tired or a bit unsteady, and they think, oh, I'm just working out more or I'm eating lighter. But internally, the levels of a toxic amino acid called homocysteine begin to rise because there isn't enough B12 to clear it out. This homocysteine starts irritating the lining of your blood vessels and your nerves. It is a slow-motion collision. I've seen patients who were marathon runners in their late 60s eating nothing but kale and quinoa who suddenly couldn't keep their balance. Their hearts were great, their lungs were clear, but their nerves were essentially frayed because they lacked that one microscopic molecule. The body's ability to absorb B12 is so fragile that even a slight change in gut health can trigger a massive neurological cascade. We have to stop assuming that eating clean is a silver bullet. For the aging nervous system, eating complete is the only thing that matters.
Doctor, we often talk about medications like they are single-purpose tools, but your description makes it sound more like a complex chemical dance, where one pill can accidentally trip another. It's particularly frightening to think about the millions of people who take something for a very common issue like acid reflux or heartburn, without realizing they are essentially turning off their body's ability to absorb life-essential nutrients. We trust these over-the-counter and prescription drugs to make our daily lives more comfortable, yet they might be setting the stage for a long-term neurological disaster. Could you share a story that illustrates this perfect storm, where someone was trying to manage multiple common health issues and ended up in a situation where their nerves were being systematically destroyed by the very treatments they relied on?
I will never forget Linda Thompson, a 72-year-old grandmother from Florida. Linda was a vibrant woman, very active in her local community, but she suffered from two very common modern ailments: type 2 diabetes and chronic acid reflux. She had been taking metformin for years, and to deal with the burning in her chest after meals, she was on a high dose of omeprazole, a common proton pump inhibitor. Linda came to me because she was terrified. She had started dropping things, her coffee mug, her car keys, even her grandchild's toys. She described a sensation of thick gloves on her hands, even when they were bare. What Linda didn't know was that she was caught in a lethal pharmacological pincer movement. The metformin was already interfering with her B12 absorption in the intestines, and the omeprazole was shutting down her stomach acid, which meant the B12 couldn't even be released from her food in the first place. She was being attacked from both ends of her digestive tract.
That is a terrifying combination. The thick glove sensation must have felt like she was losing her connection to the physical world. It's a very specific kind of horror to lose the sense of touch in your own hands. When you looked at Linda's case, how did you explain to her that these two very standard medications were working together to create this perfect storm? And is this something that most doctors are even looking for when they see a patient with these common symptoms?
Sadly, Jane, it is often missed because we tend to treat the body in silos. The GI doctor looks at the stomach, the endocrinologist looks at the blood sugar, and no one is looking at the nerves until they start to fail. I sat Linda down and explained that her body was essentially in a state of internal starvation. I told her that by taking those two medications, together she had created an environment where her vitamin B12 levels had plummeted to near zero. Her nerves were literally dying because they couldn't maintain their protective coating. She was shocked because she thought she was being good by taking her pills. I had to tell her that the pins and needles weren't a new disease, but a predictable side effect of her pharmacy cabinet. We had to act fast because when B12 stays that low for too long, the damage to the spinal cord can become permanent. Linda's story is a warning to everyone. Just because a drug is common doesn't mean it's harmless. We are often trading temporary comfort for permanent neurological health, and that is a trade no one should have to make without knowing the risks.
Doctor, you've mentioned that these deficiencies can lead to a point where the damage becomes irreversible, and that is perhaps the most frightening prospect of all. There's a specific kind of dread that comes with losing control over your own movements, the feeling that your legs are no longer yours or that you might fall at any moment. It's a loss of independence that every senior fears. You've talked about the science behind this, involving things like homocysteine and methylmalonic acid, but for those of us who aren't scientists, it feels like a breakdown in communication between our brain and our limbs. Can you help us understand what is actually happening in those moments when the body stops responding? How do these chemical imbalances physically poison the nerves to the point where they simply stop sending the right signals to our brain?
It is helpful to think of it as a double-edged sword of destruction. On one side, as I mentioned, the protective myelin sheath is dissolving because there isn't enough vitamin B12 to rebuild it. But on the other side, there is an actual buildup of metabolic trash. When B12 is missing, your body can't process two specific substances, homocysteine and methylmalonic acid, or MMA. Think of MMA like a corrosive acid that starts to build up in your system. When levels get too high, this acid actually begins to attack the fatty acids in your nervous system. It doesn't just stop the repair, it actively eats away at the existing structures. This is why a person starts to feel unsteady. The nerves in your feet that tell your brain exactly where the ground is, what we call proprioception, are the first to go. When those signals get garbled or short-circuited by this metabolic trash, your brain literally loses track of your feet. You look down and see the floor, but your brain isn't feeling the floor. That is why people start to shuffle or walk with their feet wide apart. They are desperately trying to find a stable base that their nerves can know, longer perceive.
The idea of metabolic trash eating away at our nervous system is a haunting image, doctor. It explains that terrifying disconnect so many people feel when they say they feel wobbly or disconnected. It's not just muscle weakness, it's a failure of the internal GPS. Is there a point where the brain just gives up on trying to communicate with the legs? I've seen people who seem to have lost that spark of movement, where every step looks like a monumental effort of will rather than a natural action. How deep does this poisoning go before the body simply retreats into immobility?
It goes very deep, Jane, all the way to the spinal cord. If the B12 deficiency is left unchecked, we see a condition called subacute combined degeneration. This is where the long tracts of the spinal cord, the main highways of information, actually start to deteriorate. At this stage, it's not just a tingle, it's a complete blackout of information. The brain sends a command to step forward, but the highway is broken and the message never reaches the legs. This is the stage where we see people becoming wheelchair-bound, not because their muscles are gone, but because the wiring is destroyed. I've seen patients who were misdiagnosed with multiple sclerosis or even early-stage Parkinson's, when in reality their nervous system was just drowning in MMA and homocysteine. The tragedy is that this poisoning is often silent for years. You don't feel the trash building up, you only feel the crash when the highway finally collapses. That is why monitoring these levels, not just a standard B12 test, but specifically the MMA levels, is the only way to catch the poison before it burns the whole house down.
It is so easy to overlook the small signs, isn't it? A little numbness in a toe, a slight stumble on a rug. We tell ourselves we are just tired or clumsy. But your description of the highway collapsing makes it clear that these tiny signals are actually the body's emergency flares. By the time someone is shuffling or losing their balance, they have already been in trouble for a long time. I want to talk about that critical window where we still have a chance to turn things around. Could you tell us about a patient who perhaps ignored those early whispers of the body until they became a shout, someone whose experience serves as a stark warning about the cost of waiting too long to listen to what our nerves are trying to tell us?
George Anderson is a name that stays with me as a cautionary tale. George was 81 years old, living in Pennsylvania, and he was a very proud Stoic man. He had been a vegetarian for over 30 years for ethical reasons, which he felt kept him cleaner than his peers. About 10 years ago, he noticed his big toes felt a bit cold and numb. He ignored it. Then, he started having trouble buttoning his shirts in the morning. His fingers felt clumsy. Again, he told himself he was just 81, and that's what happens. But the shout came one Sunday morning at church. George stood up to sing a hymn, and his legs simply didn't exist beneath him. He crashed into the pew in front of him, unable to feel where his feet were. He wasn't paralyzed in the traditional sense, but he had lost his sensory map. By the time he was brought to see me, George couldn't walk without two people holding him up. His whispers had been going on for a decade, but he had rationalized them away until the system finally hit a total blackout.
That moment in the church sounds absolutely terrifying, to be standing one moment and have your legs disappear the next. It's a vivid illustration of how the body can only compensate for so long before it reaches a breaking point. For someone like George, who felt he was being clean with his vegetarianism, the shock must have been profound. How do you handle the emotional fallout when a patient realizes that their own choices, however well-intentioned, led them to the brink of losing their mobility entirely? And in George's case, was it too late to repair the highway once it had collapsed so spectacularly?
It was a very difficult conversation, Jane. George felt a lot of guilt. He kept saying, "I thought I was doing the right thing for my heart. I had to explain to him that his nerves didn't care about his ethics. They only cared about the chemistry. Because he hadn't eaten meat or dairy for 30 years and wasn't supplementing correctly, his B12 stores were non-existent. We did an MRI of his spine and we could actually see the white spots of degeneration. I told him we could stop the fire, but we couldn't promise that the house would look the same as before. We started him on aggressive daily B12 injections. It took months, not weeks. Slowly, the map began to reappear. He described it as a TV screen flickering back to life after being covered in static. He eventually got back to walking with a cane, which was a miracle given where he started, but he never regained that perfect fluid balance. George's story is a reminder that your body doesn't care about your excuses for ignoring it. If you feel a whisper of numbness today, you need to act because the shout of tomorrow might be a fall you can't get up from.
Dr. George's story really highlights a massive blind spot in our modern health consciousness. Many people are turning to plant-based diets or superfoods like spirulina or chlorella, believing they are getting everything they need from nature. We see these products marketed as miracle cures for everything from low energy to aging. But you've mentioned that some of these can be incredibly deceptive, offering what you call fake B12 that can actually make a deficiency worse. It's a confusing landscape for a senior just trying to do their best. Can you break down the myth of these superfoods and explain why relying on them might be one of the most dangerous mistakes someone over 60 can make for their neurological health?
This is a point of huge medical concern for me, Jane. There is a lot of misinformation in the health food world. Many plants and algae like spirulina or certain types of seaweed contain what we call B12 analogs or pseudovitamin B12. Chemically, these look almost identical to the real B12 your nerves need. However, they are biologically inactive in humans. The danger is twofold. First, they don't do any of the work to repair your myelin. And second, and this is the scary part, they actually clog the receptors in your body. It's like putting a key into a lock that looks right, but it won't turn. And now you can't get the real key in because the lock is jammed. If you are taking these superfoods instead of real B12, you are actually blocking your body's ability to use any real B12 that might be circulating. You are essentially suffocating your nerves with a fake substitute.
That is an incredible revelation. The idea that a superfood could actually be jamming the locks of our nervous system. It makes you realize how careful we have to be with these natural labels. For our listeners who have been told to avoid red meat or who have ethical reasons for their diet, this must feel like a very narrow path to walk. If the fake versions are so prevalent, how is the average person supposed to navigate their grocery store? Is there a way to satisfy both the heart's need for a lean diet and the nerve's desperate need for authentic, functional vitamin B12?
It requires a shift from naturalism to functionalism. You have to accept that as a human being over 60, your body is no longer a perfect
extraction machine. For those who don't want to eat meat, they must understand that B12 is a non-negotiable requirement that can only be found reliably in animal sources or very specific high-quality supplements. There is no such thing as a plant-based source of active B12 that can sustain a senior's nervous system. I've looked at dozens of peer-reviewed studies from the US and Europe, and the conclusion is always the same. If you don't supplement with the right form, specifically methylcobalamin, you are playing a dangerous game of chance. We have to stop looking for miracles in algae and start looking at the hard science of what our cells actually require. It's about being smart, not just clean. You can have your heart-healthy diet, but you must bridge the gap with real bioavailable B12 or your bouts. Nerves will eventually pay the price for your dietary purity.
After so much talk about poison and collapsing highways, I want to turn our attention toward the light at the end of the tunnel. We've heard about the damage, but you also believe in the body's incredible capacity for repair if it is given the right tools. It's not just about stopping the decline, it's about actively rebuilding what was lost. I think about our listeners who might be feeling those early tingles right now and wondering if they can ever feel normal again. Could you share a story of hope? Perhaps a patient who was at a crossroads and managed to reclaim their life and their movement by making small, strategic changes to their routine?
Hope is a very powerful medicine, Jane, and I saw it shine through in a woman named Margaret Wilson. Margaret was 75, living in California, and she was what I call a polypharmacy patient. She was on medications for blood pressure, cholesterol, and a mild sedative for sleep. She came to me because her brain fog and her heavy legs were making her feel like she was 100 years old. She had lost the spark in her eyes. When we checked her levels, she wasn't just low, she was critically depleted. But Margaret was determined. We didn't just give her a standard pill. We used a sublingual approach, B12 that melts under the tongue, to bypass her aging gut entirely. Within 3 months, Margaret didn't just feel better, she felt reborn. She told me it was like someone had finally turned the lights back on in a room she had been sitting in for years.
Turning the lights back on, what a beautiful way to describe recovery. It suggests that the potential was always there, just waiting for the right switch to be flipped. For Margaret, it wasn't a massive, invasive surgery or a miracle drug. It was a strategic change in how she delivered a simple vitamin to her system. Why is the how so important? Why did the sublingual method work for her when her previous attempts at being healthy had failed? And for our listeners, what does right form, right dose, right way actually look like in a daily routine?
The how is everything, Jane. As I mentioned, the aging gut is a very poor gatekeeper. If Margaret had just swallowed a standard B12 tablet, most of it would have been destroyed or ignored by her digestive system. By using the sublingual method, the B12 enters the bloodstream directly through the mucous membranes in the mouth. It's a shortcut that bypasses the broken stomach acid and the missing intrinsic factor. We also made sure she was using methylcobalamin, which is the active form that the brain can use immediately, rather than cyanocobalamin, which the body has to work hard to convert. Margaret took 1,000 micrograms every morning, and she stayed consistent. She also started a very gentle walking routine to retrain her nerves once the repair crew was back on the job. The lesson from Margaret is that your nerves are waiting for you to help them. They are designed to survive. They just need you to stop making it so hard for them to get the supplies they need. It's the smallest habit, a tiny tablet under the tongue, that can save you from a wheelchair.
We are coming toward the end of our time, and I want to make sure our listeners leave with a very clear roadmap. We've talked about the what and the why, but the how is where the power lies. Science has advanced so much in how we measure and treat these deficiencies, yet many standard blood tests still use outdated ranges that might tell a senior they are normal when they are actually in the danger zone. If someone is listening to this and they want to take control of their neurological health today, what are the gold standard tests they should be asking for? And based on the latest research, what are the specific numbers and forms of B12 they should be looking for to ensure their highways remain open and clear?
This is the most important takeaway of the day. First, don't settle for a simple serum B12 test. In many labs, a level of 200 or 300 pg/ml is considered normal, but for a person over 60, that is often a neurological disaster zone. You want to be at least above 500, ideally closer to 800. But the real gold standard is a test for methylmalonic acid, MMA and homocysteine. These are the trash markers I mentioned earlier. If your B12 is normal, but your MMA is high, your nerves are still being poisoned, you must advocate for these tests. As for the solution, the research is clear. 1,000 micrograms of methylcobalamin daily is the threshold that shows real clinical improvement in nerve conduction. This isn't just a supplement. At that point, it's a neurological intervention. We've seen in studies that this dosage can actually help remyelinate or re-insulate the nerves over time.
It's empowering to hear that we can be our own advocates in the doctor's office. Asking for the MMA and homocysteine tests sounds like a critical step in getting a true picture of what's happening under the hood. It's also fascinating that such a specific dose, 1,000 micrograms of the methyl form, can actually begin the physical process of re-insulating those nerves. It gives a sense of agency back to the patient. For those who might be worried about taking too much, is there a risk? Or is the body generally able to handle this repair crew coming in at such a high volume?
Vitamin B12 is water-soluble, Jane, which means it has an incredibly high safety profile. Your body is very efficient at using what it needs for the nerves and the brain and simply washing away the rest. Unlike some vitamins that can build up to toxic levels, B12 is remarkably gentle. The risk isn't in taking too much, the risk is in taking too little or taking the wrong form. When you provide that 1,000 microgram dose, you are essentially flooding the zone to make sure that even with an aging gut or interfering medications, enough B12 makes it to the spinal cord to do the work. I tell my patients, don't be afraid of the numbers on the bottle. Be afraid of the trash building up in your nerves. The science is on your side here. We have the data, we have the delivery methods, and we have the results. You just have to be the one to start the process.
Doctor, we have traveled through some very dark territory today, the burning nights, the metabolic trash, and the collapsing highways, but we are ending on a note of profound resilience. It seems the ultimate message is that our bodies are not just machines destined to break. They are living systems that are constantly trying to heal, if we only listen to what they need. As we wrap up this episode of Healthy Kidneys After 60, I want to ask you for one final thought. For the person sitting in their kitchen right now, feeling that familiar tingle in their toes and wondering if it's too late for them, what is the one thing you want them to hold on to as they turn off this podcast and go about their day?
Jane, if there is one thing I've learned in 50 years of medicine, it is that the human nervous system is more forgiving than we give it credit. My final message is simple. Your age is a number, not a diagnosis. That pain, that numbness, that fear of falling, it is a conversation your body is trying to have with you, not a sentence you have to serve. It is never too late to start the repair process. Whether you are 60 or 90, whether you've been on metformin for a decade or have been a vegetarian for a lifetime, the repair crew is still inside. You waiting for the supplies to arrive. Don't let anyone tell you that suffering is normal. Go to your doctor, ask for the MMA test, and start protecting your wiring today. You have spent a lifetime building your wisdom and your memories. You deserve to have a body that allows you to enjoy them without pain. It has been an honor to share these stories with you, Jane. Thank you for giving a voice to those who have been suffering in the dark.
Dr. Gupta, thank you. Your words have provided not just clarity, but a real sense of hope for so many. You've reminded us that we are the stewards of our own health, and that with the right knowledge, we can navigate the challenges of aging with grace and strength. To our listeners, thank you for joining us on this journey today. If Robert, Linda, George, and Margaret's stories touched you, please remember that you are not alone in this. We are here to bring you the truth behind the symptoms. If you found this episode helpful, please subscribe to Healthy Kidneys After 60 and share this with someone you love who might be struggling in silence. We have so much more to explore in our upcoming episodes, from kidney health to the secrets of longevity. Until next time, I'm Jane Pauley. Listen to your body, advocate for your health, and remember, your golden years should be spent in the light, not in the fire. Goodbye for now.